Whoever said sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me was a bloody liar. Because the pain I felt when I heard my wife of 15 years tell me, "I don't love you anymore," was astronomical. It was a visceral, physical sensation, one I suppose some people might call heartache, and it was so terrible that I didn't eat or sleep until I finally turned to the bottle to facilitate both. I continued to drink all throughout the divorce, and somewhere along the way, strong painkillers entered the mix. Less than a year later, I was living as a functioning alcoholic in a small apartment, but the deeper I slipped into addiction, the less I was able to remain functioning. In the end, I got sacked from my job for being drunk on duty. I was served an eviction notice, I lost almost everything, and if it wasn't for a last-minute placement in a hostel-based rehab wellness program, I'd have actually been flat out homeless. The hostel was located in this big red brick Victorian building maybe a mile or so outside the city center. Although it wasn't entirely free, the wellness program was subsidized by the city council, so it didn't cost too much per night. It was also run on a completely voluntary basis, meaning you could check out whenever you like, and the staff provided a variety of services and amenities to keep you from relapsing. It seemed the only real downside was that I'd have to share a room with someone. Little did I know, it was the companionship that really got me through. I stayed in a large bedroom with 2 single beds and an ensuite bathroom, and when I arrived, I was paired with a guy named Andy. Like I said, I wasn't too happy to be sharing a room with a total stranger, and while I'm sure the hostel was just happy to pack their rooms out with paying guests, it was a buddy system by design. After hours, when the hostel was kept running by a skeleton crew, roommates could keep each other accountable, and like I also mentioned, that's what really got me sober. Andy's situation was almost identical to mine. His wife had an affair, she kept the house, he got addicted to crack and heroin, then lost almost everything. He said the only thing that stopped him from just ending it all was the idea of his daughter growing up without a dad. So right when he hit rock bottom, he begged an old friend to help him get a place at a wellness center. It was a familiar story, and we initially bonded over our shared experiences and football chat. But then, by the time we were going through the worst of the withdrawals together, I was actually shocked at how much me and Andy had bonded. We could barely get out of bed, either from shakes and chills or just raw depression, and although all the staff and nurses that visited us were fantastic, it was mutual support and solidarity that really got us through. But even after the worst of the physical symptoms of withdrawal had subsided, this black cloud of soul-crushing depression remained over me, and in a moment of madness, I made a serious error of judgment. As I might have mentioned, our presence at the hostel was entirely voluntary, meaning we could just leave and visit some nearby shops if we felt well enough. Mentally speaking, I've been feeling the worst I'd ever felt, so Andy suggested that he nip to the shop so he could pick us up something sugary. We weren't eating very well at the time, and quick hits of glucose were all that was keeping us fueled at one point. I took Andy up on the offer, gave him a few quid to get some Mars bars, then he told me he'd be back in a few and walked out the door. I then got up, walked into the bathroom, threw one of my disposable razors down onto the floor and stomped on it until the blade came loose. I was going to step into a warm shower, then I was going to cut my wrists and let myself bleed out under the hot water to stop the blood from clotting. I just couldn't imagine being able to get back on top in life. I couldn't imagine being a normal person again. Whatever was going on in my brain is hard enough to even articulate. I think I was just going through a complete nervous breakdown. I'd never considered taking my own life before, and I haven't since. But in that bleakest of bleak moments, I just didn't want to be alive anymore. I know I dithered over it. I don't know how long for, but I know I spent a long time trying to gather the courage to go through with it. Then, when I'd finally convinced myself there was no other way out, right when I was about to run the blade along my forearm to open up every blood vessel I could, I heard Andy walk through the door to our room. I was faced with this now or never moment, but I realized I couldn't do it. Not if Andy was going to be the one to find me or have to deal with trying to save my life when I just didn't want him to. There were no locks on the bathroom doors, and when he didn't see me in the room, Andy poked his head into the bathroom to see if I was okay. He'd already saved my life by that point, just his presence stopped me from going through with it. But when he saw the broken razor and put two and two together, he restrained me until I dropped it. That was a messy one, probably the worst day of my life, but the point is that I genuinely believe that Andy saved my life that day. If I had been in a room on my own, I wouldn't be around to write this. I got a lot of counseling and therapy after that, and a doctor stopped by with a prescription of some antidepressants, but again, the biggest help was Andy. He was the one who told me that it was just a moment of madness, that I didn't have to be ashamed, and that things were going to get better for me. He talked me through the whole thing, and for a long time I believed I owed him my life. Andy got out of the wellness program about 6 weeks before I did, but we kept in touch and met up for a coffee when I got out. Rebuilding our lives obviously kept us both very busy, so it's not like me and Andy met up often, but we kept in touch daily, and over time, he became the best friend I had in the world. We rebuilt our lives in parallel, helping each other out every step of the way. Then right when I thought the pair of us were basically in the clear, I got a phone call from him late one evening, asking if I could do him a favor. When I asked what this favor entailed, Andy's voice got all serious, and he told me it was something he couldn't go to anyone else with, and something he couldn't talk about over the phone. I found that a bit ominous, and I instantly understood that he'd broken the law in some way, but I never could have guessed how terrible things really were. I gave Andy my address, but he insisted on meeting me in the car park of a quick save that was about 10 minutes walk from the flat I was staying in. Just a year previous, I'd never have met a mate in a dark car park after they'd told me in so many words that they'd done something terrible and against the law. I'd have just told them to be honest or to go to the police if it was really serious. But times change, and I'd changed too. I don't know if you've ever felt like you owed someone your life before, but if you haven't, there's no other feeling quite like it. The only thing I can remotely compare it to is the feeling you have for your mom or dad. You wouldn't exist without the person who saved your life. You owe them everything. So even if they ring you up and give you some really dodgy story about needing your help, you go running to help them. I spotted his car in the quick-save car park, walked over to it, and climbed in the passenger seat. Right away, I could sense how bad things were. When I asked Andy what was going on, he repeated all the stuff about not being able to turn to anyone else. He never came out and said that I owed him one. I don't even think that he really saw it that way, but I felt indebted enough to at least hear him out. He told me he needed help shifting something, and at first, I misinterpreted that as him saying that he needed to sell something that was probably drugs. Andy hadn't just been an alcoholic, you see. He'd been into all sorts of stuff before he decided to go into rehab, so my guess was that this favor was somehow connected to all of that. But then, when I asked him what we were shifting, he just told me it was in the boot of his car, and that afterwards, he'd need help cleaning the boot out. And that's when this cold, sick feeling spread through my stomach, and I asked Andy to tell me exactly what was in his boot. He stayed quiet for a second, but he was visibly trembling when I followed up by asking him if there were drugs in his boot. He just shook his head, and that's when I knew. I just knew it from the way he was acting. There was a body in his boot, a dead body, and when I asked him if that was the case, if he was actually asking me to help him dispose of human remains, he just nodded. I remember exactly how I felt that night, sitting in the passenger seat of his old Rover, realizing that my best mate in the world was asking me to risk everything for him. I could feel my heart thumping in my chest as this cold sweat started to soak in my armpits, and I'm ashamed to say that just for a second, I actually considered helping him, at least until I asked who it was. He took a while to answer me, and I could see him struggling to hold back the tears, but eventually he managed to squeeze out the words, "The wife, and the fella I found her with." 2 dead bodies. Not 1, but 2. I remember cupping my hands over my mouth at that. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. But all the while, there was this voice in my head telling me that I owed him my life, and that I should help him no matter the cost. But then, helping Andy cover up 2 murders wouldn't really be helping him. The guilt would eat him alive. The police might eventually catch him, and in that case, I'd go to prison too for helping him dispose of 2 bodies. I'd like to be able to tell you that my mind was made up by my morals and that as much as I loved Andy as a friend, I couldn't bring myself to cover up such a hideous misdeed. But it wasn't that. It was nothing but pure, selfish fear. I did the right thing for the wrong reasons, and I told him I couldn't help him. Andy then asked if I was going to go to the police, and from the heart, I told him I didn't know. I'll never forget how cold he suddenly sounded when he realized I might turn on him, and what he told me in that dark car sends absolute chills through me, even all these years later. You know I can't let you out now, don't you? Andy was a person I'd grown to feel 100% safe around. So, for that feeling to suddenly shift until I felt like he might be about to kill me, it had me so scared that I was shaking in my seat. I asked him if he was going to hurt me, and he told me, "I don't want to, but I will if you make me." I spent the next few minutes pleading my case, or more accurately, pleading for my life. I told him the same thing I've mentioned previously, that he was bound to get caught since a woman's addict ex-husband is always bound to draw suspicion. It's just a matter of time, and he couldn't run forever. The best thing to do would be to turn himself in, and to let me go to the police so I didn't get any time either when the truth finally came out. I think the thing that actually convinced him, the thing that saved my life, was when I was mentioning not calling the police until I got back to my flat. That was at least a 10 to 15 minute head start for him to think about what he was going to do. Somehow, he agreed, and after I pleaded with him one more time to do the right thing, he told me to get out of his car. And the walk back to my flat was the longest 10 minutes of my life. The whole way I had this horrible fear that Andy was going to change his mind, turn around in his car, and run me over at high speed after mounting the curb. That, or he'd be waiting for me in the driveway of my building, ready to ambush me with the same thing he killed his wife with. I know this might sound mental, but I remember thinking how if he really did drive back and run me over, he'd be justified. I owed him my life, and I just turned my back on him when he needed me the most. Not only that, but I was going to actively betray him by informing the police about what he'd told me. Don't get me wrong, part of me was angry that he got me involved in the first place, but truth be told, a lot of what I was feeling on that walk was guilt. Rotten, festering guilt. I got back to the flat, picked up the phone, and called the police. I told them everything Andy had told me. They promised to send someone over as soon as possible, and then I sat down on the only piece of furniture I had in the living room and just cried. I never could have imagined how doing the right thing could have hurt so much, but life is full of surprises that way. Just like I never had imagined plotting to take my own life after the love of my life disappeared on me. But then, that's why Andy had to go to prison. It hurt something awful to let my ex-wife go, but I had to. I had no other choice. The right thing to do was to let her find happiness, even if that was in the arms of another man. Andy had robbed his wife of the chance of that. I don't blame him for descending into a rage when he saw another man making himself comfortable in the place he'd called home for so many years. But it didn't warrant a death sentence. It wasn't fair. And that's what I told myself as I sat there waiting for the officers to arrive. Over a few cups of tea, I told them everything I knew, and after they left, I tried to go on as best I could with my life. I didn't hear back from any police officers, and for a few weeks I expected to wake up in the middle of the night to see Andy standing over me with a knife or something, and if he did, I'd understand why. Those few weeks were the closest I'd ever come to falling off the wagon, but I kept it together, and enough time passed for it to fall to the back of my mind. I didn't stop thinking about Andy, though. He popped in my head at least once a day, and I'd wonder where he was and how he was doing. Sometimes I imagined him in prison. Other times I imagined him on the run, and sometimes I imagined him in the worst places. And I wondered how I'd go about finding him if he ended up dead or in prison. We have a system here in the UK called Find a Prisoner, and a few years ago, I used it to reach out to Andy to find out if he was in prison. I found out that he was in Wakefield prison, so I reached out to him. He'd been there for me at my lowest, so the least I could do was return the favor, even if I had helped put him there in the first place. It took a while to receive a reply, but eventually I heard back from him. I still have that letter tucked away somewhere safe, still with the tear stains on it when I read the part where he wrote, "I forgive you." Just over 6 years ago, me and my husband found a wonderful little rental home out in the suburbs that was what I can only describe as suspiciously cheap. We went for viewing and the interior was incredible, and we left wanting to move in even more. But this completely flummoxed me and my husband as we were determined to find out what the catch was. Eventually, we found it, and what kept the place so affordable is the fact that it was adjacent to a bail hostel. This meant that if we moved in, we'd be living opposite people who were fresh out of prison, and we'd be living that way for the foreseeable future. It wasn't like we were living next to an ex-con, someone we could get to know, someone who had already been rehabilitated and had settled down after a wild youth. No. Our neighbors would be newly released on God knows what charges, and we just have to hope we didn't have any bad encounters with any of them. As it turned out, living opposite the bail hostel was almost completely uneventful. Granted, some of the people you saw coming and going from the place definitely looked a little suspicious, but the vast majority looked like perfectly normal people, and were probably just so glad to have their freedom that they didn't act up while staying there. So, the first floor of our house was about 4 foot off the ground, and our kitchen window gave me an almost perfect view of the bail hostel across the street. This meant that every time I was washing up, cooking, baking, or doing laundry, the washing machine was in the kitchen, I'd have a pretty clear view of people coming to and from the bail hostel. I guess this just makes me sound incredibly nosy, but just knowing it was a bail hostel had me very interested in those coming and going, obviously. You could tell when a person was a parole officer or some other kind of official, as they were wearing a suit or an ID badge or something of that nature. And I've already told you about the folks who were obvious drug addicts from the way they looked. But then every so often, you'd see someone walking out who looked way too normal to have been to prison. Those are the ones I found myself studying a little more intently, just wondering what could have happened to lead them astray, along with what they had actually done to be locked up. For years we lived in almost complete tranquility. Then one day, that peace was shattered. This one day I was washing some dishes when another one of those very ordinary criminals came walking out of the bail hostel. He looked to be in his 40s, was slightly overweight, and had a ring of red hair crowning a balding head. He just looked like a regular dad type, and as I wondered if he'd picked up one too many DUIs or had gotten involved in some kind of financial crime, a car pulled up next to the driveway of the bail hostel. Whoever was in the passenger seat must have done something to get the red-headed man's attention, because he walked over to the passenger window and leaned down as if to better see who he was talking to. Then, in an instant, I saw a puff of smoke followed by a bang, and the man's face disappeared into a slurry of gore. I instinctively dropped down out of sight and then grabbed my phone off the countertop before dialing 911. I wasn't scared of any more shooting, as I've heard the car's tires screech as it sped off, but I was so freaked out that I didn't want to emerge from the cover of the kitchen cabinets. All just instinct, I suppose. So when I told the 911 operator what had happened, she put me through to the police dispatcher, and when I told them what happened, the dispatcher asked me to stand up and take a look at the victim. I told him I'd rather not do that, but the dispatcher said they needed to know two things: if the victim was moving or breathing, or if they were armed. I told him that I didn't know if I could, but the dispatcher actually pleaded with me, saying that the victim's life was at stake, and if I wanted to help, I'd do as they asked me. It seemed a little harsh at the time, but I guess they're paid to save lives, not to be nice, and it got me to do what they were asking, so I guess it worked. If I'd known what I was about to see, I'd never have stood up and looked at all. The man wasn't moving, and thankfully, I didn't have a very good view of the bloody mess that used to be his face. But that's not what really traumatized me that day. I took cover the moment I saw it happen, so obviously I didn't see this, but whoever had blown his face off had taken the time to step out of the car, pull the guy's pants off, and cut something very prominent off of his lower half. As soon as that registered with me, I sank down beneath the sink unit again, then told the dispatcher that he wasn't moving, there was no gun, and that respectfully, I wouldn't be looking at the man's body again. Not long after, I heard the first sirens, and within the hour, the whole street was filled with emergency service vehicles. Obviously, since I was the only witness to the man's murder, I spent an awful lot of time being interviewed by the police. But as much as I tried to be as helpful as I could, I'm not sure the case went anywhere. The only thing we learned about the dead man in the time after that was that he was a registered offender against children. But whether or not that had anything to do with his murder is anyone's guess. What I do know is what I saw that day was the single most horrifying thing I'd ever seen in my life. And if it wasn't a single isolated incident, I think we'd have moved a long time ago. During the summer of 2020, a 27-year-old Frenchman named Jan Bourdon defied pandemic-era travel restrictions to embark on the trip of a lifetime. According to friends and family, Jan was a highly sociable young man with a hunger for knowledge and travel. He had studied history at the prestigious Parisian Sorbonne University. At first, Jan made his way from his home city in Paris to Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania. Then, after a few weeks of exploring the cobblestone streets of the medieval old town, Jan turned his gaze southward. He traveled via bus and train through Hungary, Croatia, and Bulgaria, taking his time to soak up each region's distinct culture and history before moving on. After more than a year of traveling, Jan ended up in the fabled Turkish capital of Istanbul. Then, following a week or so of wandering the city's ancient but vibrant bazaars, Jan set his sights on Egypt and traveled by plane to a popular tourist town known as Sharm el-Sheikh on July 25th of 2021. Jan kept himself extremely busy during his time in Egypt and regularly kept his friends and family updated on the things he got up to. He sent them a panoramic photograph taken at the summit of Mount Sinai, followed by pictures of the spiritual oasis at St. Catherine's Monastery, and spoke of how warm and welcoming the local Egyptians could be. One such email was sent on July 28th of 2021 and detailed the hospitality of a man Jan described as an off-duty police officer. It's not clear how he and Jan met, but this police officer promised Jan a ride to the Egyptian capital, Cairo, if Jan could meet him in the port city of Suez. If his email is to be believed, Jan and the police officer met for dinner on the evenings of July 28th, then traveled with him to Cairo the following day, and he eventually informed his sister of his safe arrival in an email dated August 4th. Jan talked of the excitement he felt at having visited Cairo's ancient Coptic quarter, then mentioned how he was staying in a small hostel along with a number of other travelers, and that he'd be in touch with them soon. In his quest to travel off the beaten path, Jan often found himself in areas with poor internet and cell phone reception. So when a few weeks went by, and Jan's family had yet to hear from him, they didn't immediately worry for his safety. Yet when his mother's birthday rolled around, and Jan failed to make any kind of contact, his family began to suspect that something was wrong. Jan always made a point of calling family and friends on their birthdays or during the holidays, so his failure to do so that September was completely out of character. Come November, Jan's family still hadn't heard from him, so they contacted the French Foreign Ministry to officially report him missing. The French Foreign Ministry then contacted Egyptian authorities via their Cairo embassy, but were confused by the claims of Egyptian officials who claimed that Jan had never stepped foot onto their country's soil. This obviously perplexed his family, who were in possession of several photographs of Jan posing next to famous Egyptian landmarks. To claim Jan was no longer in Egypt would be one thing, but for Egyptian authorities to deny that he'd ever been there was extremely disconcerting. French police then set about analyzing Jan's financial records in order to paint a picture of his movements, and it was through this method of investigation that they noticed something curious. 4 days after his final correspondence, Jan's bank card had been used at an ATM near the Sadat subway station in Cairo's Tahrir Square. Whoever used it did so on 4 separate occasions and had completely emptied Jan's bank account in the process. Suspecting that some kind of robbery may have occurred, French police then attempted to trace Jan's movements using security camera footage. Their first point of inquiry was the Cairo hostel Jan had claimed to be staying at. But when police contacted the owners, they claimed that no one under the name of Jan Bourdoun had checked in with them over the previous few months. French police then asked the hostel to provide them with their reception area's security camera footage from the date Jan arrived in Cairo, but worryingly, the hostel claimed to have misplaced the footage from this particular day. To the horror of both investigators and Jan's family, it seemed that a genuine conspiracy was afoot, as efforts had clearly been made by the Egyptian authorities to slow or frustrate their investigation. For almost an entire year, the French government petitioned the Egyptians on behalf of the Bourdoun family, demanding they share any information on Jan's well-being and whereabouts. When Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi visited Paris for a diplomatic meeting in July 2022, Jan's family protested his arrival, holding placards which read, "Where is Jan Bourdoun, President Sisi?" The family also enlisted the help of the Swiss-based non-profit organization Committee for Justice, who agreed that the Egyptian state was somehow involved in Jan's disappearance. The organization then submitted a complaint to the United Nations Bureau of Involuntary Disappearances, who in turn pressured Egypt to conduct a full and transparent investigation. Then, during July of 2022, journalists from the Italian newspaper La Stampa reached out to the Bourdoun family to inform them that Jan's disappearance was eerily similar to that of 28-year-old Giulio Regini. Giulio was an Italian student who vanished from the streets of Cairo back in 2016. Right around the time his family reported him missing, his mutilated corpse was found dumped in a ditch alongside the Cairo-Alexandria highway, and an independent investigation showed that his killers might have been Egyptian security officials. Naturally, this caused the Bourdoun family a great deal of concern, who still hoped to bring Jan home on his feet and not in a box. But over time, they too were forced to accept the possibility that their worst fears had come true. Although it was increasingly clear that they were preparing for the worst, the Bourdoun family continued their campaign into August of 2022. Then suddenly, in the early hours of August 9th, Jan's mother received a phone call from what appeared to be an Egyptian number. When she answered the call and heard the voice on the other end, she felt a wave of relief so overwhelming that it made her knees buckle. It was Jan. He was alive, and he was coming home. Jan disembarked from an Egyptian air flight that landed in Paris the following day and was greeted by scores of friends and family wishing to celebrate his safe return. Yet despite being visibly happy at the reunion, those close to Jan noticed that his mood seemed unusually subdued for someone who had escaped some kind of shady, off-the-books imprisonment. Dozens of French media outlets rushed to secure an interview with their newly released compatriot, yet despite offering ever-increasing amounts of money, Jan has flat-out refused to speak publicly about his ordeal. At first, some interpreted Jan's silence as a litigative tactic, one which would precede some kind of legal action against a private Egyptian enterprise or even the Egyptian government itself. However, over the last few months, Jan's lack of media outreach has proven to be very out of character for someone with a legitimate grievance. It's not unusual for an aggravated party to announce their intention to take someone to court, even when their defendant is a large multinational corporation or foreign government. So, in this case, the question remains, why has Jan remained so tight-lipped regarding his disappearance? Perhaps the biggest clue to why Jan had stayed so quiet pertains to the kidnapping and murder of the Italian student, Giulio Regini. Following Giulio's disappearance on January 25th of 2016 and the discovery of his body just a few days later, Italian authorities launched a thorough investigation into his death. Just months later, it was announced that the Italians had singled out 5 Egyptian nationals they suspected of being involved in Giulio's detention, torture, and murder. All 5 were members of Egypt's National Security Agency. It should also be noted that Giulio was researching alternatives to the long-standing domination of Egypt's economy by the state and the military, an endeavor which could have been misinterpreted as inciting some kind of rebellion. If this was indeed the case, and the Egyptians confused Giulio with some kind of spy, then it stands to reason that their NSA would want to ascertain his purpose in their country. Yet instead of a long and harsh interrogation, the NSA subjected Giulio to a truly nightmarish torture session and thus placed him in a horrifying predicament. Protest his innocence and face more torture, or lodge a false confession to stop the agony and face the repercussions of international espionage. Considering the condition his corpse was found in, it's more than likely that Giulio refused to make a false confession and was subsequently tortured to death. Perhaps under the advice of his new police officer friend, Jan was placed in a hostel whose management was in league with Egyptian authorities. This placed Jan in a position to be swiftly snatched up by security agents once they decided to question him and would explain why the establishment suddenly misplaced the CCTV footage which would have proven he was there. Then, in order to avoid the same mistakes of Giulio Regini's detention and eventual death, perhaps Egyptian security officials pursued a different tactic in order to coax a confession from their subject. Perhaps a less physical form of torture was used in favor of a considerably more psychological one so horrific that it ensured Jan's media silence. What if an elaborate blackmail scheme was put into place, with Jan's interrogators recording themselves doing something to him during his detention, something they threatened to release online if he ever spoke of his ordeal? Or perhaps while digging through Jan's personal history, Egyptian security officials discovered one of his deepest, darkest secrets. That would certainly explain why someone with such a pronounced grievance would opt to remain silent among a veritable media firestorm. There's always a chance that the explanation is far simpler, and that Egyptian officials promised Jan that his loved ones would suddenly befall a variety of accidents if he ever talked to the media. If Jan was indeed detained for the better part of a year and was subject to regular interrogations, there's no doubt that his captors would have extracted detailed information regarding his family, friends, and personal life. If this was the case, and Jan genuinely feared for their safety, it would certainly explain his reluctance to give extensive media interviews. Despite the amount of research I put into Jan's vanishing and reappearance, all of my theories amount to nothing more than speculation. The only people who know what happened to Jan over the last year are the man himself and the Egyptian officials who have been so obviously duplicitous in their explanations. We can only hope that in the near future, Jan finally decides to reveal what happened to him during his period of detention, and that the French government provides adequate protections against any potential reprisal. Until then, all we can do is wait and wonder, while hoping that Jan's story can serve as a warning to those who wonder where they may not be welcome. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Australia's Byron Bay is one of the most popular tourist destinations on Earth, with approximately 2 million yearly visitors reveling in the small coastal town's sun, sand, and surf. During the summer months, it's believed that the number of tourists in Byron outnumbers the town's permanent residents, and the vast majority of these visitors are a very particular kind of traveler: backpackers. The backpackers who visit Byron Bay each summer tend to be between the ages of 18 to 25 and share an interest in experimentation, spirituality, and recreation. As a result, Byron has garnered a reputation as being something of a hippie hub, a place which attracts as many yogis as it does party animals. And it's this reputation which attracted an 18-year-old Belgian man by the name of Theo Hayes. By late May of 2019, Theo had spent the better part of a year traveling around Australia following the suspension of his engineering studies. He spent a great deal of time in the company of his cousin, Lisa Hayes, who had played a huge role in convincing a reluctant Theo to give traveling a try. Lisa later said that unlike many of his peers who had flocked to Byron for the town's party scene, Theo was content to remain sober and lucid during his time there. He was responsible and mature, wise beyond his years, and he made a point of calling his parents every few days to reassure them that everything was fine. Theo arrived in Byron Bay on Wednesday, May 29th of 2019, with his plan being to spend a few days in town before traveling back to his home in Belgium via Melbourne and Sydney. Upon his arrival, Theo checked into the Wake Up Hostel, located about 20 minutes walk outside of the town center. The Wake Up is one of the most upmarket of Byron Bay's hostels, offering complimentary transport and single-person accommodation, and it definitely constitutes one of Byron's most tranquil places to stay. But still, there came a point when Theo decided to celebrate his travels in a typical teenage fashion. On the evening of May 31st, Theo joined a handful of his fellow wake-up guests in visiting a liquor store located in Byron's northern hotel. The hotel's security camera footage captured Theo and his friends purchasing a bottle of rose wine at approximately 7:45 p.m. They seemed to be acting perfectly normal during the transaction, and then once they had obtained their alcohol, Theo and his friend caught the shuttle back up to Wake Up. There, they shared the wine with some of the other guests in the hostel's common area before deciding to head over to a popular backpacker bar named Cheeky Monkeys. It's quite clear that Theo was under the influence of alcohol by that point, as a visit to a bar like Cheeky Monkeys was extremely out of character for him. Cheeky Monkeys had a reputation of being the rowdiest place in Byron Bay, and this is probably down to the fact that it didn't close its doors until the early hours of the morning. After midnight, Cheeky Monkeys' patrons tended to be so intoxicated that violent incidents are a nightly occurrence, and at one point, the bar was ranked as one of the most violent in the whole of Australia. It seems odd that Theo would seem content to visit such a place, even if he had been drinking, but his behavior inside the bar itself was even more out of character. According to the people he was drinking with that night, Theo had only consumed one glass of wine back at the Wake Up, and it was only his second drink at Cheeky Monkeys when his behavior took a distinctly perturbing turn. By 11 p.m., Theo seemed to go from relatively sober to highly intoxicated in less than half an hour, and the last his new friend saw of him was when he was being escorted off the premises by the bar's security staff. A handful of Theo's party members went to check on him, but after he assured them that he wasn't too drunk to get back to their hostel, they simply wished him good night and carried on drinking. All believe that Theo was capable of making it back to the hostel, even if it was a little wobbly on his feet. In reality, this was the last time anyone would see him alive. Instead of heading straight back to the hostel, Theo took something of a detour. We know that Theo had headed down to Kingsley and Johnson Street, both viable routes back to the hostel, but from there, he appears to have gotten turned around. According to his phone records, we know that Theo messaged several members of his family and friends via WhatsApp, and that he used Google Maps on a number of occasions in an attempt to navigate back to his hostel. Yet instead of following the suggested route, Theo walked from Kingsley Street onto Tennyson Street in the direction of Byron's Bay's Youth Activity Center. This is the complete opposite direction to the Wake Up Hostel, so either Theo was too drunk to comprehend the directions he was being given, or he had some other reason entirely for his impromptu detour. It's this second idea we're forced to seriously consider, as after arriving at the Youth Activity Center, Theo began walking very quickly towards a street known as Milne Track. According to his phone's metadata, the speed at which he walked away from the activity center was almost twice as fast as his regular walking speed. This could well be down to his frustration at getting himself lost, with Theo wishing to make up for the lost time by increasing his walking speed. However, there's always a chance that Theo increased his walking speed because he felt like he was in danger. Instead of sticking to the poorly lit streets, Theo walked about halfway down Milne Track, then turned off into some dense, dark woodland. Despite the almost impenetrable foliage, Theo maintained his rapid walking speed as he made his way through the brush. Jagged branches and biting thorns must have cut his arms and legs to ribbons, yet still he made an effort to move as quickly as possible. Theo might have been intoxicated, but he clearly believed that suffering a few cuts and grazes was preferable to whatever was pursuing him. After emerging from the other side of the brush, Theo found himself on a stretch of beach near a place known as Tallow Beach, and this is where the trail runs cold. The last time his phone connected to the Cape Byron cell tower was 1:42 p.m. the following day. After that, it appears to have been turned off. Theo didn't return to the hostel. He didn't board the Greyhound bus. He didn't catch his flight back to Belgium. Then, after a few days of silence, Theo's mother contacted the Australian authorities to file a missing persons report. Knowing they had already lost around 72 hours of valuable search time, the Australian police rushed into action. A team of around 50 officers combed the area around Byron Bay, with airborne search units accompanying ground teams equipped with drones and cadaver dogs. Theo's parents, Laurent and Vincent, flew over to Australia to assist in the search effort, and the couple made multiple appeals to the Australian public to keep their eyes open for any sign of their boy. When I left Belgium, I promised Theo's little brother I would bring his brother home, Theo's father said. Please help me keep my promise to him. As the search for Theo progressed into the summer months, Theo's parents petitioned the Australian government to continue their search for their missing son. Their persistence led to the discovery of a gray puma hat in the brush near Tallow Beach during July of 2020, one identical to the one Theo was wearing at the time he disappeared. While it would be entirely reasonable to assume that Theo lost his hat due to his advanced state of intoxication, it seemed more than likely that it was knocked off by a branch as he ran through the dark patch of brush. If there was no urgency or threat to the situation, it stands to reason that a person would have stopped walking to at least try to look for their hat. But Theo didn't, and this is one of the strongest indicators that he wasn't just drunk that night. He was being pursued. Yet without any solid eyewitness statements, there was no way for police to conclusively prove that Theo was being chased by anyone, and frustratingly, they turned to other explanations for his disappearance. The general consensus among law enforcement was that either misadventure or him taking his own life were to blame for Theo's death. In their eyes, there was only one feasible explanation for his disappearance. His body had been carried away by the tides after he'd fallen off some cliffs near a local lighthouse. When his parents insisted that Theo had everything to live for and that he had no history of mental health problems, the Australian police simply fell back on the idea that the fall was the result of severe intoxication. They seemed to completely ignore the speed at which Theo had been moving, as well as the idea that his movements were designed to be evasive. If Theo was being pursued by someone with ill intentions, this might explain why his body had never been found, as it had been disposed of somewhere that it was guaranteed not to wash up on the shore again. But who could Theo have offended so badly that they'd wish to see him dead? It turns out that one of the only reasons Theo's drinking buddies believed him to be highly intoxicated was the fact that he was escorted out of Cheeky Monkey's. Drinkers who have reached their limit are often escorted out of bars by its security staff, and such occurrences were commonplace at a place like Cheeky Monkey's. But the fact remains that Theo only had 2 or 3 drinks by the time he was ejected from the premises, and Theo's drinking buddies didn't actually witness the events that led to Theo's ejection. Maybe Theo had angered another patron that night, either through spilling a drink or flirting with the wrong girl. If this was the case, and the security staff intervened before a confrontation could occur, perhaps the offended party followed Theo out of the bar before chasing Theo through the brush. Perhaps this person then engaged Theo in a physical confrontation, one that ended in his untimely death. And if this confrontation occurred near to the cliffs opposite Byron's lighthouse, all it would take to dispose of Theo's body would be to toss it off the cliff. Such an event would mark a violent, needless end to Theo's life, one with terrifying implications for solo travelers worldwide. But even so, there is a far more chilling theory to explain Theo's disappearance, one which hasn't been properly explored by Australian law enforcement. We've already established that Theo only had 2 or 3 drinks before he was escorted out of the bar, and while his low tolerance for alcohol might explain his heavy intoxication, there was another possible explanation for his state of inebriation. Theo's drink may have been spiked. While the identity of the person who spiked Theo's drink might well remain a mystery, their motivations are certainly up for speculation. The only reason anyone spikes a person's drink with a dissociative narcotic is to make them non-combative and easier to control, and the effects of such a drug might explain Theo's inability to follow the directions given to him by Google Maps. The dosage might have been enough to slow him mentally, but it evidently wasn't enough to slow him physically, not at first anyway. Perhaps Theo had the energy and composure to make it through the thick patch of brush and out onto Tallow Beach, but after that, maybe the drug started to take full effect, rendering him incapacitated in the same spot his cell phone's metadata trail ran cold. There remains a possibility that Theo's body was never found, not because it was washed away into the Pacific Ocean, but because he's still alive. Theo didn't take his life that night, nor was he murdered by some angry drunken patron of the bar he'd been drinking in. Theo disappeared because Theo was kidnapped by someone working with a human trafficking ring. When Theo went missing, he joined a list of 2,600 long-term missing people who have disappeared in Australia. 6 of these disappearances occurred within just a few kilometers of Byron Bay, and none of these people have ever been found. 54-year-old Ellen Wilson went missing on September 11th of 2015 and was last seen at her Byron Bay hotel before departing in her silver Subaru station wagon. The following morning, Ellen arranged to meet a friend in Ballina, and when she failed to show up, her friend reported her missing. Ellen Wilson was never heard from again. 31-year-old mother of 2 Bronwyn Winfield was last seen at her home in Lennox Head, a small coastal town just south of Byron Bay. She was reported missing 11 days after she disappeared on May 27th of 1993. In the absence of her dead body, the examining coroner recommended that a known person be charged with her murder, but sadly, law enforcement simply did not have enough evidence to charge this person of interest. Years later, in 2009, police reopened the investigation into her disappearance and offered a $100,000 reward to anyone with pertinent information, but her disappearance remains unsolved. Margaret Ryan and Jeffrey Neville disappeared from the town of Mullumbimby in 1986 and 1993 respectively, and just like the other cases, their bodies were never found, and they were never heard from again. 23-year-old Rodney Bradridge also disappeared from Mullumbimby, but somehow the Australian police have neglected to draw parallels between his 1997 disappearance and those of the other victims whose bodies have never been found. Those who have gone missing around Byron Bay, and particularly those who vanished near Mullumbimby, might well have fallen victim to the same perpetrator, someone who potentially could be linked to a national or international human trafficking ring. Granted, that is pure speculation on my part, but there is clearly something deeply unsettling occurring in the area of Byron Bay and Mullumbimby. If these people were being murdered, why has there never been any forensic evidence of violence? And if their deaths were natural or accidental, why hasn't a single body ever been recovered? These people are simply vanishing from the face of the earth and have been doing so for the better part of 20 years, but without any solid leads or evidence, the Australian police are basically powerless to do anything about it. It's possible that there's an entirely reasonable and innocent explanation for these people's disappearances, and while each remains intensely tragic, that foul play might simply not be to blame. However, if my darkest suspicions are correct, then Byron Bay and its surrounding area have been the same hunting grounds of some very dangerous people for almost 2 decades now. And until there's some kind of break in the case, these people are free to continue kidnapping with near impunity. So, as the world comes out of lockdown and the travel industry begins to boom once again, be very careful if you decide to go backpacking anywhere, because some of those who visit Byron Bay never see their homes ever again. The scariest call I'd ever had as a cop was a medical call involving a 3-year-old girl. My first department I worked for required all officers be first responder certified. Basic medical training, not enough to be an EMT or medic, but above first aid. We would normally respond to medical calls until the EMTs arrived just to secure the scene. This particular call came out as a 3-year-old girl having a seizure. The location of the call was this battered woman's hostel we have here in town, with the closest vehicle access being the front entrance, and I had to go on foot to the actual room. When I pulled up to the front, dispatch upgraded the call and informed the girl had just gone into cardiac arrest. I started running to the room, which was nowhere near the front of the hostel, and after finding it, the family was in complete hysterics. I saw the little girl on the ground in the place's communal kitchen, who was still seizing. However, I could see that she was turning blue in the face. The mom grabbed me and started screaming to save her daughter. I hadn't performed CPR since the academy. I told the mom and everyone to go out into the hallway and for someone to run to the front to guide the EMTs when they arrived. Suddenly, it was now just me and the girl in the room, and the gravity of the situation suddenly hit me. There was no way EMS would get there in time to help her. I paused for about 10 seconds and just tried to collect myself, or froze up. It's cliche, but those 10 seconds I felt were an absolute eternity. Somehow, I snapped out of it and began CPR. And amazingly, with the first compression, she suddenly let out a giant cough and started breathing again. I've been a police officer for 5 years now, responded to countless fatal wrecks, shootings, stabbings, murder scenes, etc. But nothing was as scary as sitting there on the floor next to that girl, knowing if I didn't do something, she was gone. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you get a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, if the raccoons don't get you, the bunny will.